The dust was a constant companion. It rose from the horses' hooves in fine red clouds, settled on the worn leather of the stagecoach, and worked its way through the cracks around the windows to coat Evelyn Hart's tongue with the taste of grit and distance. For 3 days, the taste had been the same. It was the taste of the Arizona Territory. She peered out at the landscape, a sweeping expanse of stone and sky that made her feel as small as the last letter on a long page. Back in Missouri, the world was green and contained, hemmed in by rolling hills and dense woods. Here, the world was open, raw, and seemed to stretch into a forever that was both magnificent and terrifying. The horizon was a hard, clear line, broken only by the silhouettes of mesas that rose from the plains like ancient, sleeping beasts. The sky was a blue so deep it seemed to hold its own weight. This was her new home. The thought carried a peculiar mix of excitement and a deep, unsettling loneliness. Her father, a man who saw God's word as a fortress, had raised her within its sturdy walls. He had given her an education, a fierce belief in the power of knowledge, and a certainty that goodness was a thing to be built, not just hoped for. But his world had been one of books and sermons, of predictable seasons and the quiet hum of a settled congregation. He would not have understood this land, this savage beauty that promised nothing and concealed everything. After he passed, the life he had built for her felt like a well-tailored dress that no longer fit. The letter from the Territorial Council, seeking a teacher for the frontier town of Red Mesa, had been a key turning a lock she did not know was there. She was going to build something of her own, a school, a place where letters and numbers could be as solid and useful as a stone wall. The coach lurched violently, throwing her against the opposite seat. The driver's shout was cut short, a ragged sound torn apart by the wind. Outside, the steady rhythm of the hooves broke into a panicked scramble. Another man, a portly salesman who had snored for the better part of the journey, jolted awake, his eyes wide with alarm. Through the dust-caked window, Evelyn saw them. 3 riders, their faces obscured by dirty bandanas, their pistols held with a lazy confidence that was more menacing than any outright threat. One of them rode forward, his horse blocking the team's path. The driver, a weathered man named Jed, had his hands raised high. The salesman fumbled inside his coat. Evelyn heard him whisper a prayer. One of the riders trotted his horse alongside her window and peered in. His eyes were small and dark. Set in a sun-scorched face, he grinned, a humorless flash of yellowed teeth. He said, "Looks like we have a pretty bird in the cage. Get on out, miss, and bring your valuables with you." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. All the stories she had read, the hushed warnings from her aunt in St. Joseph, they all felt flimsy and distant until this moment. This was real. The smell of unwashed bodies, the glint of sun on a gun barrel, the dry scrape of fear in her own throat. But alongside the fear was a spark of something else, a cold, hard anger. These men were like the rocks on the plain, unthinking and brutal. Jed, the driver, spoke from his perch, his voice tight. "Now hold on, boys. There is no need for this. We do not have much." The leader of the bandits spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He said, "We will be the judge of that. Get down from there, old man." As Jed began to climb down, his movements stiff with age and apprehension, Evelyn made a decision. Her father had taught her that yielding to evil only emboldens it. She would not cower. She clutched her satchel, the one containing her father's Bible and her teaching certificates, tighter. It was all she had of value. Before she could speak, before the salesman could find his voice, a new sound cut through the tense air. It was not loud, just a single, sharp call from the rocks above the trail. It sounded like a hawk, but it was too precise, too deliberate. The 3 bandits stiffened, their heads snapped toward the sound. The leader squinted, his hand tightening on his pistol. He yelled, "Who is there? Show yourself!" There was no answer but the sigh of the wind across the high plateau. The horses, sensing the shift in tension, stamped and snorted. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then he appeared, not with a crash or a shout, but with a fluid silence that was more startling than any noise. One moment the rock ledge was empty. The next, a man was standing there. He was Navajo. That much was clear from his buckskin clothing, the turquoise at his throat, and the way he stood, poised and still as the stone itself. He held a rifle, but he did not point it. He simply held it, and its presence was enough. Another figure materialized from the shadows on the other side of the trail, and then a third. They were all Navajo, all armed, all moving with the same unnerving quiet. They had surrounded the bandits without a single hoofbeat, without a snapped twig. The bandits exchanged nervous glances. Their lazy confidence evaporated, replaced by the twitchy alertness of cornered animals. Their 3 pistols suddenly seemed insignificant against the rifles of the silent men who had appeared from the very earth. The man on the ledge spoke. His voice was low and calm, yet it carried across the distance with absolute clarity. He spoke in English. He said, "This is our land. You are not welcome here. Leave the coach." The bandit leader hesitated, his face a mask of anger and indecision. He snarled, "We are not afraid of you." The Navajo man did not move a muscle. He simply replied, "You should be." There was a long, stretched-out silence. The sun beat down. A bead of sweat traced a path through the dust on Evelyn's window. The bandit leader looked at his men, at the silent figures on the rocks, and then at the stagecoach. The fight went out of him. With a curse, he wrenched his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Their retreat, as chaotic as their arrival, had been arrogant. The dust they kicked up began to settle. The Navajo man on the ledge lowered his rifle and, with a lithe movement, slid down the rock face to the trail. The other 2 followed, their rifles now resting in the crooks of their arms. Jed, the driver, let out a shaky breath. He stammered his thanks. The salesman was mopping his brow with a handkerchief, muttering about the dangers of this God-forsaken country. Evelyn opened the coach door and stepped out, her legs unsteady. She needed to feel the solid ground beneath her feet. The Navajo man who had spoken walked toward them. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes. He was not handsome in the way of the men she had known in Missouri, with their soft hands and polished manners. His face was all angles and planes, carved by sun and wind. There was a stillness about him, a deep, centered calm that seemed to draw all the scattered energy of the confrontation into itself. He was perhaps 28, a man in his prime, yet his eyes held a maturity that seemed far older. He stopped a few feet from the coach, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing. When his eyes met Evelyn's, they held for a moment longer than was necessary. She saw wariness in them, a guarded appraisal that was not unfriendly, but deeply reserved. She felt a strange jolt, a flicker of recognition for a soul she had never met. She was not a fanciful woman, but in his gaze she saw a reflection of the land itself, vast, quiet, and possessed of a strength that did not need to announce itself. For his part, Nabahi saw a woman who did not look away. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky before a storm, were wide with a fear she was trying to master, but beneath it, he saw resolve. She stood straight, her hands clasped before her, not in a gesture of supplication, but of control. She was not like the other white women he had encountered at the army fort where he had once served as a scout and messenger. They were either brittle with fear or cloaked in a disdain they wore like a second skin. This one was different. She looked at him not as a savage or a savior, but as a man. It was a look that was as rare as rain in the dry season. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He told Jed, "It is safe now. We will follow you to Red Mesa." He turned without another word and swung himself onto his horse, a sturdy pinto that had been waiting patiently in the shade of a juniper. His men mounted as well, and the three of them fell into place behind the stagecoach, their presence a silent, watchful promise. As the coach started moving again, Evelyn found she could not stop watching the rider in the rear view. He rode with an easy grace, a part of his horse, a part of the landscape. He was a warrior. The words settled in her mind with a simple, undeniable truth. And she, a pastor's daughter who had never known a day of violence, felt a profound and unsettling curiosity about what it meant to be such a man in such a land. Red Mesa was less a town and more a raw wound on the landscape. A single dusty street was flanked by a collection of false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a land office, and the sheriff's office, which shared a roof with a small, grim-looking jail. The wind, which had been a constant presence on the plains, seemed to get trapped here, swirling the red dust into eddies that stung the eyes and coated every surface. There was a tension in the air, a brittle feeling that had nothing to do with the dry heat. Men watched each other from under the brims of their hats, their hands never far from their belts. As the stagecoach pulled up, Nabahi and his men reined in their horses at the edge of town. Their duty done, they would not enter. Evelyn understood why. The looks they received from the townspeople were a mixture of fear and contempt. She felt a pang of shame for her own people. She got out of the coach and, on an impulse, turned to face Nabahi. She wanted to thank him properly, but he was already turning his horse away, melting back into the landscape from which he had come. A man with a silver star pinned to his vest stepped forward. He was tall and broad, with a florid face and pale eyes that missed nothing. This was Sheriff Pike. He helped Evelyn with her trunk, his manner a little too helpful, his smile a little too wide. The sheriff said, "Welcome to Red Mesa, Miss Hart. We have been expecting you. I trust your journey was not too eventful." Evelyn replied, "It had its moments." "Sheriff," his eyes flickered toward the trail where the Navajo riders had been. He said, "Indeed, we have our share of trouble in these parts, but you are safe now. This is a town of law and order." Somehow, the way he said it made it sound like the opposite of the truth. The inciting incident, when it came, was not a gunshot but the rustle of paper. A few days later, the whole town was gathered in front of the land office. Silas Crowley, the man who owned the mine and was financing the new railroad spur, stood on the porch. He was a man built of soft living and hard ambition, his fine suit an affront to the dust and heat. He held up a map, a stark black line drawn across a familiar terrain. Crowley announced with a booming voice, "Progress is coming to Red Mesa. This new line will connect us to the main railway, bringing prosperity for all. It is a great day for our community." He unrolled a document, a contract offering compensation to the Navajo for the use of their traditional grazing lands, the very lands the black line on his map cut through. A murmur went through the crowd. Evelyn stood near the back, listening. She saw Nabahi standing with a group of Navajo elders, his face impassive, his eyes missing nothing. He had seen maps like this before at the army fort. He knew how a simple line on a piece of paper could sever a people from their history. He knew the words on the white man's paper were often as slippery as sand. An elder spoke up, his voice raspy with age. He asked, "What does this paper say? We cannot read your words." Crowley smiled, a benevolent, patronizing expression. He said, "It says you will be well paid for your cooperation. It is a generous offer, a chance to join the modern world." As Crowley was speaking, Sheriff Pike strode through the crowd. He grabbed a young Navajo man, barely more than a boy, by the arm. The boy had done nothing but stand and listen. The sheriff declared, "This one is making trouble. I am taking him in for vagrancy." The boy's eyes widened in fear and confusion. The crowd parted, silent and watchful. This was a demonstration, a show of force. This was Pike reminding everyone who held the power here, whose side the law was on. Evelyn felt a surge of the same cold anger she had felt during the holdup. This was not justice. This was bullying. Plain and simple. Before she could think, she stepped forward. She said, "Sheriff, on what grounds are you arresting him? He has done nothing wrong." Pike turned to face her, his smile gone. His pale eyes were like chips of ice. He said, "Miss Hart, this is official town business. It does not concern you. I suggest you stick to teaching children their letters." Evelyn stood her ground, her voice clear and steady. She replied, "It concerns anyone who believes in fairness. You cannot simply arrest a man for no reason." A hush fell over the crowd. Silas Crowley looked down from the porch, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. This was not part of his plan. Sheriff Pike took a step closer to her. His sheer size an intimidation tactic, he said in a low, menacing voice. "I can do whatever I need to do to keep the peace in this town. You are new here, Miss Hart. You would be wise to learn how things are done. Consider your name added to my list of troublemakers." He yanked the young man's arm and dragged him toward the jail. The boy's mother began to wail. Evelyn stood frozen in the dust, her heart pounding. The townspeople began to disperse, their eyes avoiding hers. They did not want to be associated with a troublemaker. She looked over and saw Nabahi. He was still standing with the elders, but his eyes were on her. The wariness was still there, but now, mixed in with it, was something else. A flicker of respect, a spark of a shared understanding. The line on Crowley's map was not the only one that had been drawn that day. Another line had been drawn in the red dust of the street, and she and the silent Navajo warrior now stood on the same side of it. The fire burned low in the center of the hogan, its light painting dancing shadows on the faces of the men gathered there. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the murmur of the Dine language. Nabahi sat listening, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. He had reported what he had seen in Red Mesa, the map, the contract, the sheriff's casual brutality, the white woman who had spoken out. Now the elders spoke. They were men whose memories were long, etched with the bitterness of broken promises and forced marches. One of them, a man named Hastian, whose face was a beautiful map of 100 hard seasons, held up a hand for silence. His voice, when he spoke, was like the rustle of dry corn leaves. He said, "A signature on the white man's paper is like the wind changing direction. It promises rain and brings only dust. They come with their iron horses and their shouting, and they do not see the land. They see only what lies beneath it. They do not hear the songs of the ancestors. They hear only the ring of silver. We have signed their papers before. Each time, our world has grown smaller." A younger man, hot-blooded and angry, spoke from the shadows. He said, "Then we should not sign. We should fight." Nabahi watched the fire. He had seen the white man's fighting. He had served at Fort Defiance, had seen the cannons and the long lines of soldiers. He knew that courage was not always enough. He said, "Hastian speaks with wisdom, but the young man speaks with the truth of our hearts. The question is not if we fight, but how. Their weapon is paper. Their strength is in their laws that bend to the will of men with money. We cannot fight them on that ground alone." He looked around the circle. His words carried weight, not because he was the loudest, but because he had been outside. He had seen the enemy's world from within. He had learned its language. He said, "We must know what the paper says, and we must know what the men who wrote it are truly planning." His eyes drifted, for a moment, to a memory of a pair of blue eyes, wide with a fear that had not yet defeated her spirit. A woman who believed in the power of words. Perhaps, he thought, that was a weapon they could use as well. Evelyn Hart's school was not a building, but a promise. It existed under the shade of a gnarled cottonwood tree at the edge of town, where the single dusty street began to fray into open scrubland. Her students were a collection of the town's forgotten children, 2 young Navajo girls, whose mother worked washing clothes for the soldiers. Came shyly at first, their dark eyes full of a cautious curiosity. A boy named Mateo, whose family worked for one of the ranchers, came with a bright, eager mind. Even a pair of pale, solemn children whose father was a drunkard and a failure at prospecting found their way to her slate and chalk. She taught them their letters, the crisp, clean shapes of the alphabet. She taught them that numbers could build things and measure the world. She read to them from her worn copy of Shakespeare, the grand words sounding strange and wonderful in the dry desert air. To Evelyn, this was the most important work in the world. She was building a foundation, a small fortress of knowledge against the ignorance and cruelty of this hard land. Inevitably, her work drew attention. One afternoon, a woman named Martha Cushing, the wife of the general store owner and a self-appointed guardian of the town's social order, marched down the street toward the cottonwood tree. Her face was set in a mask of stern disapproval. 2 other women trailed in her wake like pilot fish. Martha Cushing stopped before Evelyn, her hands on her hips. She said, "Miss Hart, what is the meaning of this?" Evelyn, who was in the middle of showing Mateo how to form the letter B, looked up calmly. She said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cushing. I am teaching." Martha Cushing's gaze swept over the small, diverse group of children. Her lip curled. She said, "You are teaching them. It is one thing to offer charity to our own kind, but it is quite another to fill the heads of natives with ideas above their station. It is unnatural. It will only lead to trouble." The Navajo girls shrank back. Mateo's bright expression clouded over. Evelyn rose slowly to her feet. She was not as tall as Martha Cushing, but at that moment, she felt a strength that had nothing to do with physical stature. She said, her voice quiet but firm, "I believe every child has a right to an education. Mrs. Cushing, I do not believe knowledge is a privilege to be handed out based on the color of one's skin. A mind is a mind, and it is a gift from God. My father taught me that it is a sin to allow such a gift to lie fallow." Martha Cushing sputtered, taken aback by the direct, unshakable response. She said, "Your father was a preacher. I hear he would be turning in his grave to see you wasting your time and your reputation on this." Evelyn replied, "My father taught me that the most important work is often the most difficult. Now, if you will excuse me, Mateo and I have a great deal of work to do." She turned her back on the woman and knelt beside the boy. Pointing to the slate, she said, "Let us try again. A line down, and then 2 gentle curves." Defeated by a politeness more unyielding than any argument, Martha Cushing huffed and turned, herding her companions back toward the supposed civilization of the main street. The children, seeing the danger had passed, slowly relaxed. But a line had been drawn. Evelyn was not just the new school teacher. She was a pariah to the town's ruling class. Her isolation made her a target, but it also made her an ally. A few nights later, there was a soft, hesitant knock at the door of the small room she rented behind the doctor's office. She opened it to find Arthur Pence, the town clerk. He was a small, nervous man with ink stains on his fingers and fear in his eyes. He scurried inside, closing the door quickly behind him. He wrung his hands, his gaze darting around the simple room as if the walls themselves had ears. He whispered, "Miss Hart, I should not be here. If Sheriff Pike knew, or Mr. Crowley." Evelyn guided him to a chair. She said, "What is it, Mr. Pence? You can speak freely here." He took a shaky breath. He said, "I saw you, in the street. You stood up to Pike. No one does that. I have a conscience, Miss Hart, a small one, perhaps, but it gnaws at me. I have seen things. I have filed papers. Things are not right here." He told her about the land claims, how Crowley was using old, obscure laws to invalidate Navajo grazing rights. He spoke of bribes and backroom deals. Then his voice dropped even lower, to a terrified whisper. He said, "It is the storehouse, the Navajo winter stores. Crowley was talking to Pike. He said if the Navajo would not sign the contract, a little fire might persuade them that this land is no longer safe for them. They plan to burn it, soon, before the first snow, to force them to move or starve. A cold dread settled in Evelyn's stomach. This was no longer about legal maneuvering. It was a plan for calculated, cruel destruction. She knew she could not go to the sheriff. The sheriff was part of it. There was only one person she could turn to, a man who had appeared from the rocks when she needed him most. The next evening, just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, she walked to the edge of town, near her Cottonwood school. She carried a small bundle, some bread, and a piece of cheese. She did not know what else to do. She just waited, feeling the vastness of the approaching night. A small, solitary figure in an immense landscape. He came as he had before, with a silence that was a sound in itself. She did not hear Nabahi's approach until his voice came from the shadows behind her. He said, "It is not safe for you to be out here alone. School teacher." She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing by the trunk of the cottonwood, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not threatening, simply present. She said, "I was hoping I might see you. I need to talk to you." He stepped into the fading light, his eyes searching her face. He said, "You spoke for a boy who had no voice. Why?" She answered simply, "Because it was the right thing to do." He considered this for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. He said, "What do you need to tell me?" They sat on a flat rock as the first stars pricked the deep purple of the sky. The air grew cold. Evelyn told him everything Arthur Pence had revealed, her words tumbling out in a hushed, urgent rush. When she finished, the silence of the desert seemed to press in on them. A coyote yipped in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound. Nabahi stared out into the darkness. His jaw was tight. He had suspected Crowley was ruthless, but this was a new level of evil. To destroy a people's food was to destroy their future. It was a declaration of a war that would be fought not with bullets, but with starvation. He finally turned to her, his gaze intense. He asked, "Why do you bring this to me? Why not your own people?" She met his gaze without flinching. She said, "Because it seems my own people are the ones lighting the match, and because I think you are a man who understands what honor means." That night, an unlikely alliance was forged in the cold desert air. They were two people from different worlds, a teacher and a warrior. Brought together by a shared sense of justice, they began to meet in secret. She, with her ability to read the white man's documents, became his eyes. He, with his knowledge of the land and its people, became her guide. She translated a shipping manifest she obtained from a sympathetic freight worker, revealing that Crowley was importing far more blasting powder than his mine required. He led her on a quiet ride along the proposed railway route, showing her how the line cut off vital water sources for the Navajo flocks. During one of these clandestine journeys, Nabahi reined in his horse on a high ridge overlooking the surveyor's camp. From their vantage point, hidden among the pinon and juniper, they could see the campfires and hear the faint sound of men's laughter. But it was a large map, spread out on a table under a lantern. That held their attention. It was far more detailed than the one Crowley had shown in town. Nabahi's body went rigid. He pointed, his finger trembling almost imperceptibly. He said, "There, that canyon, and the 3 small mesas that stand like sentinels at its mouth." Evelyn peered through the small spyglass he handed her. She saw the landmarks he described, crudely but clearly drawn. She said, "What is it?" His voice was a low, guttural sound, filled with a pain that was ancient and deep. He said, "It is Chenili, the place of the ancestors. It is where our grandfathers and their grandfathers are buried. The line on their map, the path for their iron horse. It goes directly through the heart of our sacred ground." Evelyn lowered the spyglass, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the night air. The pieces clicked into place. This was not just about greed for land or water. It was an act of profound desecration. Crowley was not just trying to move a people. He was trying to erase them, to sever their connection to their past, to the very bones of their ancestors. The cut on the map was a cut into the soul of the destiny, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her own bones, that this was a violation that could only be answered with a fight to the end. The knowledge of the desecrated burial ground sat between them, a cold, hard stone. It changed the nature of their mission. What had begun as a fight against greed had become a defense of the sacred, to gather more proof, to understand the precise layout of Crowley's plan. They needed to get closer to the surveyor's main camp, a place Nabahi knew was heavily guarded. This meant a long, circuitous ride through the Badlands, a maze of arroyos and canyons that offered concealment but demanded endurance. For 2 days they rode under a relentless sun, speaking little, conserving their energy. The world was reduced to the creak of saddle leather, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, and the shimmering heat that warped the air above the red rocks. The dust became a second skin, a gritty film that covered their clothes, their faces, their hands. Evelyn felt it in her throat, in her eyes, a constant reminder of the harshness of this land. Yet, she found a strange rhythm in the hardship. Riding beside Nabahi, she felt a sense of purpose that was as clear and sharp as the desert stars at night. He moved through the landscape not as a conqueror, but as a part of it, his eyes constantly reading the subtle language of a bent twig, a disturbed patch of sand, the flight of a distant hawk. He was teaching her to see. And in doing so, she felt herself becoming a part of this world in a way she had never imagined. Late on the second day, they found what they were looking for, a small, hidden canyon with a ribbon of green running through its center. A tributary of the San Juan River had carved this secret oasis, and a stand of ancient cottonwood trees grew along its banks, their leaves whispering in the faint breeze. It was a place of peace in a land of struggle. Nabahi dismounted and held up a hand. He said, "We will rest here until dark. It is close enough. We can approach the camp on foot after the moon rises." As they unsaddled the weary horses and led them to the water, a new sound reached them, the distant, unmistakable rumble of shod hooves on rock and the low murmur of men's voices. It was a patrol, likely from the surveyor's camp. Instantly, Nabahi's calm focus sharpened into a blade of pure alertness. He said in a low, urgent voice, "Down, behind the rocks, now!" He pulled her with him, his hand firm on her arm, and they scrambled into a shallow declivity behind a jumble of sandstone boulders. He pressed her down, shielding her body with his own as they lay flat against the cool earth. The space was tight, forcing them into an intimacy that was purely functional, yet undeniably potent. Evelyn could feel the hard warmth of his chest against her back, the steady, slow beat of his heart. She held her breath, her own heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm. The riders came closer. She could hear their coarse laughter, the jingle of their spurs. They were Crowley's men. She could tell by their careless arrogance. They stopped by the river, just yards from their hiding place, to water their horses. One of them began to complain about the heat, the dust, the pay. Another bragged about what he would do when the railroad money started to flow. Their voices were a violation in this peaceful place. Evelyn lay perfectly still, the scent of sage and Nabahi's earthy scent filling her senses. She was afraid, but it was a focused fear, not a panicked one. His presence was a solid, reassuring weight, a silent promise of protection. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, with a last round of curses and complaints, the men mounted up and rode on, their sounds fading into the vast silence of the canyon. They waited, unmoving, until long after the last echo had died. Nabahi shifted, rolling away from her to peer over the rocks. He said, "They are gone." Evelyn let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She sat up, her limbs stiff, her dress covered in red dust. The sun was low in the sky, spearing through the canyon walls in shafts of golden light. The air was beginning to cool. The immediate danger had passed, but a different kind of tension remained, a quiet awareness of each other that had been forged in their shared concealment. Nabahi rose and went to the river's edge. He stood for a moment, looking not at the water, but at the sky. The western horizon was on fire, a breathtaking spectacle of orange, pink, and a purple so deep it was almost black. The light softened the hard edges of the rock, painting everything in a wash of ethereal color. He turned back to her. His face, caked with the dust of their journey, was unreadable. He said, "I must wash. The trail is long." He turned his back to her and began to unbutton his shirt. Evelyn's first instinct, a lifetime of modesty drilled into her by her father's sermons, was to look away. It would have been the proper, ladylike thing to do. Her cheeks grew hot, but she found she could not. She was frozen in place, a silent observer in the fading light. He shed his shirt, revealing a back and shoulders corded with muscle, his skin the color of polished copper. Scars, pale lines against the dark skin, told stories of battles she could not imagine. He moved with an unhurried, practical grace, untying his leggings, stepping out of his moccasins. There was no shame in his movements, no artifice. It was as natural as a hawk shedding a feather. The Navajo warrior bathed naked in the river at sunset, and the virgin's eyes wouldn't look away. The phrase formed in her mind, a line from a book she had never read, a truth she had never known. He waded into the cool, clear water, the river swirling around his powerful thighs. He splashed water on his face, his arms, his chest, the setting sun glinting on the droplets. He was magnificent. It was not a thought of sin or of the flesh, though she was undeniably aware of him as a man. It was something deeper. She was seeing, for the first time in her life, a person who was completely and utterly free. He was a part of the water, a part of the sky, a part of the ancient rock. In her world, the body was something to be hidden, controlled, a source of shame and temptation. To him, it was simply himself, strong and clean and alive in the cooling water. Everything she had been taught, the rigid rules, the fear of nature, the separation of spirit and body, all of it seemed like a cage, a small, dark room she had never realized she was in until this very moment. He was the world outside that room. He must have felt her gaze. As he turned to come out of the water, his eyes met hers across the short distance. He did not falter. He did not try to cover himself. He simply held her gaze, and in his dark eyes, she saw not anger or embarrassment, but a quiet, solemn understanding. He had seen her watching, and he had understood the nature of her look. He had recognized it not as a violation, but as a form of witness. He walked out of the river, water streaming from his body, and picked up his clothes. He dressed with the same unhurried economy of motion, his back still to her. When he was done, he turned to face her. The purple twilight had deepened, softening the lines of his face, making his eyes seem like dark pools. He walked over to where she sat on the rock, his moccasins making no sound on the sandy soil. He stopped before her. He asked, his voice low and soft, "Are you afraid of me?" Evelyn Hart. It was the first time he had used her full name. It sounded new, as if he had just forged it. She looked up at him, at his clean, damp face, and found she had no room for lies. "Not here, not now." She said, "No, I think, perhaps, I am afraid of myself." A small smile touched the corners of his mouth, a rare and fleeting thing. He said, "That is a greater fear. I know it well." He sat on the rock beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. The cottonwood leaves whispered above them. She said, her voice barely a whisper, "Where I come from, there are so many rules, walls around everything. What to say, what to think, what to feel. My father, he was a good man, but his world was a fortress. I lived inside it my whole life. I thought I was safe. I did not realize I was a prisoner." He looked out at the darkening canyon. He said, My people also have rules. We have ceremonies to keep us in balance with the world, but a warrior learns a different kind of rule. He learns to be still, to watch, to be ready. He builds a wall inside himself. He does not show pain. He does not show fear. He does not show his heart. That, too, can be a prison. They sat in silence, two prisoners sharing a moment of parole in the vast, open cathedral of the desert, the boundary between them, the one that had defined them as teacher and warrior, as white and Navajo, as man and woman, had dissolved in the purple light. They were just two people, burdened by the walls they had built, and the ones that had been built for them. Evelyn felt a wave of honesty so powerful it left her breathless. It was a terrifying, liberating feeling. She looked at his strong, quiet profile against the last glow of the sunset. She said, her voice trembling slightly, "When we first met, I wanted to help you, to fight for what was right. Now, I am afraid. I am afraid that I will want to come back to this river, not because of our mission, but because of you." She had said it, the most honest and vulnerable words she had ever spoken. She held her breath, expecting him to recoil, to retreat behind his warrior's wall. Instead, he turned his head and looked at her. The understanding in his eyes was so deep, so complete, that it made her own heart ache. He did not move closer. He did not touch her. He simply gave her the gift of his full attention, of his acceptance. He said, his voice a low murmur, "To be yourself, Evelyn Hart, is not a thing to fear. It is the only battle worth fighting, for any of us." He reached out then, not to touch her face or her hand, but to gently take a stray leaf from her hair, his fingers brushing her temple for a fleeting second. The touch was as light as a moth's wing, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was a touch of profound, respectful intimacy. The boundary had been crossed. The careful alliance of convenience had been reforged into a bond of trust so deep it felt like the beginning of something she had only ever read about in books, a cautious, fragile, and utterly real love. The quiet intimacy they had found by the river was a fragile peace, a brief shelter from the storm they both knew was gathering. They returned to their separate worlds under the cover of darkness, the unspoken promise of that moment, a warm, living thing between them. But the storm did not wait long. It broke 2 nights later, not with rain, but with fire. A hot, dry wind had been blowing all day, a devil wind that rattled the windows of Red Mesa and scoured the plains, carrying the scent of dust and distant lightning. It was the kind of wind that frayed nerves and set teeth on edge. In the dead of night, it carried a different scent: wood smoke, thick and acrid, and something else, a sharp, chemical odor that did not belong in the clean desert air. A rider, his horse lathered in a panic, brought the news to the Navajo camp first, the storehouse, the large, sturdy adobe structure where they kept the winter provisions, the corn and dried meat, the blankets and seeds that meant the difference between life and a slow, hungry death, was burning. By the time Nabahi arrived, the flames were a roaring, hungry beast, leaping into the night sky, painting the underside of the wind-whipped clouds in a terrifying shade of orange. The fire was unnaturally fast, unnaturally ferocious. It did not consume the building. It devoured it. The heat was a physical blow, driving people back. The community was in chaos, men shouting uselessly, women weeping in despair, their faces illuminated by the destruction of their future. Nabahi's heart grew cold and hard in his chest. This was not an accident. This was the fulfillment of the whispered threat Evelyn had brought to him. This was Crowley's answer to their refusal to sign his paper. Amid the panic, a woman's shriek cut through the roar of the fire. It was a sound of pure terror. She was pointing at a small, lean-to structure attached to the main storehouse, a place where tools and firewood were kept. Her young son, a boy of 6 named Little Sparrow, had been sleeping there, seeking refuge from the wind. Now, a fallen, burning timber blocked the doorway, and the roof was beginning to sag. Without a second's thought, Nabahi moved. He grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from a nearby horse and plunged it into a water trough, soaking it through, wrapping the heavy, dripping fabric around his head and shoulders. He ran toward the lean-to, ignoring the shouts of warning from the others. The heat was a living entity, searing his lungs with every breath. He heaved at the burning log, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest as splinters of fire bit into his hands. With a great, grunting effort, he rolled it aside and plunged into the smoke-filled space. He found the boy huddled in a corner, coughing and crying, his eyes wide with terror. Nabahi scooped him up, wrapping the small body in a corner of the wet blanket. He said, his voice a low, calming rumble, "I have you, be still." As he turned to leave, a section of the roof gave way, raining down a shower of embers and a heavy, smoldering beam. He threw himself forward, shielding the child with his own body. The beam struck his left arm, a blow of white-hot agony that nearly drove him to his knees. But he did not stop. He staggered out into the open air, the boy held safely against his chest, and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as people rushed to help. The lean-to collapsed behind them in a final, explosive whoosh of flame. He had saved the boy, but the storehouse was a total loss. As the sun rose, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. Only the blackened adobe walls remained, standing like skeletal fingers against a pale, smoke-hazed sky. The ground was a carpet of gray ash and charred debris. The smell of destruction hung heavy in the air, a funeral shroud for the community's hopes. In Red Mesa, Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke and a sense of profound dread. When the news came, it was exactly as she had feared. She dressed quickly and walked to the site, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She saw the despair on the faces of the Navajo, the smoldering ruins, the small groups of people huddled together as if for warmth against a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. She found Nabahi sitting apart from the others, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage. A medicine man was tending to the burn, a long, angry red welt that ran from his shoulder to his elbow. Their eyes met across the space of the ruins. His were filled with a cold, controlled fury. Hers were filled with a sorrow so deep it was almost an anger of its own. No words were needed. They both knew who was responsible. But knowing and proving were two different things. While others began the grim task of sifting through the ashes for anything salvageable, Evelyn's practical mind went to work. This was not the time for tears. It was the time for facts. She began to walk the perimeter of the ruins, her eyes scanning the ground. Her father had taught her to be observant, to look for the details that others missed. She found it near the back wall, in a place sheltered from the main force of the wind, a dark, oily stain on the sandy soil, and a smell that confirmed her suspicions. It was the sharp, pungent odor of kerosene. It was the same smell as the blasting powder accelerant she had read about on Crowley's shipping manifest. A fire fed by dry wood and a strong wind was one thing. A fire fed by kerosene was a firestorm. This was her proof. It was small, but it was a start. Her investigation was cut short by the arrival of Sheriff Pike and two of his deputies. They rode in as if they were a conquering army, their horses kicking up the gray ash. Pike dismounted, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over the defeated people. He said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, "A terrible tragedy. This is what happens when you have agitators stirring up trouble. Rebellious talk leads to rebellious acts." He strode through the crowd and stopped in front of the medicine man, an old, respected elder named Gray Owl. Gray Owl was a man of peace, a keeper of stories and ceremonies. He looked up at the sheriff, his ancient eyes calm and unafraid. Pike pointed a thick finger at him. He said, "I am arresting you, old man, for arson, for inciting a riot, for endangering this whole territory." A wave of shock and outrage rippled through the Navajo. Gray Owl had been nowhere near the storehouse. He was a symbol of their culture, of their connection to their faith. To arrest him was to arrest the people themselves. It was a calculated act of humiliation. Nabahi rose to his feet, his injured arm held stiffly at his side. His voice was dangerously quiet. He said, "He did nothing. You know this. This is not justice." Pike turned, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. He said, "I decide what justice is in this town. Nabahi, and I say he is guilty. Unless you want to join him in my jail, I suggest you stand down." For a long moment, the two men locked gazes. A silent battle of wills fought over the smoking ruins. Nabahi knew he could not win this fight. Not here. Not now. To resist would only lead to more arrests, more bloodshed. It was what Crowley and Pike wanted. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod to the other Navajo men. "Stand down. This is not the time." With a heavy heart, he watched as Pike's deputies bound the old man's hands and led him away like a common criminal. The loss of the storehouse was a physical blow. The arrest of Grey Owl was a spiritual one. Despair began to settle over the people like a fine, choking dust. But that evening, a flicker of hope came from an unexpected source. A freight worker, a man named Thomas who had always been quietly decent to Evelyn, found her at her school under the cottonwood tree. He was agitated, his eyes wide. He said, "Miss Hart, I have to tell you something. It is about the fire. There is a man, one of Crowley's hired hands, a fellow named Jeb. He is over at the saloon, drunk and running his mouth. He is bragging. He says he earned his bonus last night, says he lit a fire that could be seen all the way from hell. He named Crowley. Miss, he said Crowley paid him." Evelyn's mind raced. An eyewitness, a confession. This was it. She said, "Thomas, can you get him out of there? Can you bring him to the doctor's office? We need a sober witness." Thomas nodded grimly. He said, "I will try." He went back to the saloon, but it was too late. As he was trying to persuade the drunken Jeb to leave, one of Pike's deputies intervened. A fight broke out, a chaotic, violent scuffle in the middle of the crowded saloon. When it was over, Jeb lay on the floor, a knife in his ribs. The deputy claimed it was self-defense, that Jeb had pulled the knife on him. In the confusion, no one could say for sure what had happened. The only man who could directly link Crowley to the fire had been silenced forever. When Thomas brought her the news, Evelyn felt a wave of cold fury. They were not just criminals, they were meticulous. They left no loose ends. That night, she met Nabahi at their designated spot, the rocks at the edge of town. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light. She told him about the kerosene stain. She told him about Jeb, the drunken confession, and the convenient knife fight in the saloon. He listened, his face a granite mask in the darkness. When she was finished, he told her about the mood in the camp, the despair that was threatening to turn into a desire for violent revenge, a desire he was struggling to contain. He said, his voice raspy with fatigue and anger, "They want us to fight. They are trying to provoke a war so the soldiers will come. Then they can take the land and say they were restoring order." Evelyn looked at the lights of Red Mesa, a small, fragile cluster in the immense darkness. It seemed like a place of wolves masquerading as men. She said, "We cannot fight them with guns. Nabahi, we will lose. We have to fight them with the truth. My father always said that the truth is a stubborn thing. It can be buried, but it cannot be destroyed." She clutched the small, oily rag she had used to soak up the kerosene. It was not much, but it was something. She said, "I have this, and Arthur Pence, the clerk. He knows about the paperwork. And Thomas heard the confession. Even if Jeb is dead, a circuit judge is due in the territory in 2 weeks. They will hold a public court session. It is our only chance." Nabahi looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. In the face of so much loss, she was not broken. She was focused. She was a warrior in her own way. The respect he felt for her deepened, solidifying into something unshakable. He had saved a child from the flames, but this woman, with her stubborn belief in words and facts, was trying to save them all. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her arm. The brief contact was an anchor in the swirling chaos of the past 24 hours. He said, 2 weeks. We will be ready. You will bring your words, your proof. I will bring my people, not as warriors, but as witnesses. We will tell the story of the ashes. They stood together in the desert darkness, a teacher and a warrior, their 2 worlds now irrevocably intertwined. They made a silent promise, not of love, but of something just as powerful, a promise of justice. They would take their stand, not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, but in a dusty, makeshift courtroom, and they would fight with the only weapon they had left, the truth. The day of the circuit judge's arrival dawned hot and breathless. The trial, if one could call it that, was to be held in the open, on a patch of hard-packed earth between the saloon and the land office. A rough wooden platform had been erected for the judge, and the townspeople and the Navajo gathered in a wide, uneasy semicircle. There were no walls, no vaulted ceilings, just the vast, indifferent blue of the sky and the relentless glare of the sun. Dust motes danced in the thick air, and the feeling of a coming confrontation was a palpable weight. Judge Miller was a man whose face seemed to have settled into a permanent expression of weary impatience. He had a soft, fleshy body that looked ill at ease in the heat, and his eyes, small and buried in his face, darted about as if looking for the quickest route to a drink in a shade tree. He was flanked by Sheriff Pike, who stood with his arms crossed, a smug, proprietary air about him. Silas Crowley sat in a chair he had brought from his office, fanning himself with his hat, looking more like a spectator at a cockfight than a man whose enterprise was under scrutiny. The proceedings began with a farcical air of legitimacy. A lawyer from a neighboring county, a man with a booming voice and clothes too fine for the setting, announced that he had been retained by Mr. Crowley as a gesture of goodwill to ensure the accused, Gray Owl, received a fair defense. It was a move of such breathtaking cynicism that Evelyn felt a surge of nausea. Crowley was paying the man who was supposed to be defending the elder he himself had framed. When it was her turn to speak, Evelyn walked to the front, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was just a teacher. What did she know of courts and laws? But then she looked at Nabahi, standing stoic and watchful with his people, his injured arm in a sling, and she saw the faces of her students, and the memory of the smoking ruins hardened her resolve. She was not just a teacher. She was a witness. She placed the oily rag in the small jar of stained soil on the judge's bench. Her voice, when she spoke, was clearer and stronger than she had expected. She said, "Your Honor, my name is Evelyn Hart. I am the school teacher here in Red Mesa. On the morning after the fire at the Navajo storehouse, I found this at the scene. It is soil soaked in kerosene." Crowley's lawyer jumped to his feet. He boomed, "Objection. The witness is not an expert. She is a school teacher. What does she know of chemicals?" Judge Miller waved a dismissive hand. He said, "I will allow it, for now. Proceed, Miss Hart, but make your point." Evelyn took a steadying breath. She said, "Kerosene is not something the Navajo use or keep in their storehouse, but it is used at Mr. Crowley's mine as an accelerant for blasting charges. A fire set with kerosene would burn faster and hotter than a normal fire, a fire designed for maximum destruction." She presented the shipping manifest she had acquired, pointing to the unusually large quantities of kerosene that had been delivered to the mine in the weeks leading up to the fire. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not vague accusation. It was a fact on a piece of paper. Next, Nabahi was called. He did not approach the platform but stood where he was, his presence commanding more authority than the judge's bench. He did not speak of laws or papers. He spoke of the wind. He said, his voice calm and resonant, "On the night of the fire, the wind came from the north. It was a strong wind. I have lived in this land all my life. I know its breath. A fire started by accident on the north side of the building would have been pushed south, burning slowly against the wind at first, then spreading. But this fire started on the south side. It raced north into the teeth of the wind. It did this because it was not a natural fire. It was fed. It was a hungry ghost given a powerful drink. His words, simple and direct, painted a picture more vivid than any legal argument. He was using the unchangeable laws of nature as his witness, and the truth of it settled over the crowd. Crowley's lawyer tried to object, to mock the testimony as native superstition, but the image Nabahi had created held fast. For the first time, a flicker of doubt appeared on the faces of the townspeople. Despite the evidence, the judge remained unmoved. He listened with a bored expression, his rulings consistently favoring Crowley's lawyer, cutting off any line of questioning that got too close to the truth. The entire affair felt like a carefully staged play, with the verdict already written. A sense of hopelessness began to creep back into Evelyn's heart. They had presented the truth, but the ears of power were deaf to it. Then, something unexpected happened. A man pushed his way through the crowd. He was a miner, his face smudged with coal dust, his clothes shabby. It was Miguel, a man whose children sometimes came to the edge of Evelyn's makeshift school to listen to the stories. He was trembling, his eyes wide with fear, but also with a kind of desperate resolve. He stopped before the judge's platform and spoke, his voice cracking at first, then growing stronger. He said, "Your Honor, my name is Miguel. I work in Mr. Crowley's mine. I must speak. My conscience. It will not let me be silent." Pike took a menacing step toward him, but the judge, surprised by the interruption, held up a hand. The entire crowd was silent, leaning forward. This was not part of the script. Miguel took a deep, shuddering breath. He said, "The night of the fire. I was working late. I saw them. I saw Sheriff Pike's deputies. They were loading cans into a wagon, behind the mine office. The big cans of kerosene. I thought it was for the mine. But the wagon, it did not go toward the shafts. It went toward the Navajo lands." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Pike's face went white with fury. Crowley half rose from his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. Crowley's lawyer shouted, "Objection! This is a fabrication! This man is a disgruntled employee!" But Miguel was not finished. He looked directly at the judge, tears welling in his eyes. He said, "My children, they are hungry. I need this job." But they hear the stories Miss Hart tells, stories of brave men, of doing what is right. How can I look my son in the eye if I let an old, good man go to jail for a crime he did not commit? I saw what I saw. I swear it on the soul of my mother." His words, spoken with the simple, unadorned power of truth, shattered the cynical stagecraft of the trial. This was not a legal argument. It was a confession of the soul. No one in the crowd doubted him. The judge looked from Miguel's earnest, terrified face to Crowley's barely concealed rage, and then at the sea of watchful, accusing faces before him. For the first time, Judge Miller looked nervous. His own authority, his own complicity, was being laid bare for all to see. He could not simply dismiss this, not now, not in front of everyone. He banged his gavel, a sharp, cracking sound that made everyone jump. He said, his voice straining to sound official, "In light of this new testimony, this court will place a temporary injunction on the railroad expansion project, pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal. The prisoner, Gray Owl, is released on his own recognizance. This hearing is concluded." He banged the gavel again and hastily retreated, practically fleeing the platform. It was a victory, a stunning, unexpected victory. A wave of elation swept through the Navajo. They crowded around Miguel, clapping him on the back, their faces shining with gratitude. Gray Owl was released, and his family rushed to embrace him. Nabahi found Evelyn in the chaotic, celebrating crowd. The look in his eyes was more eloquent than any words. He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, and for a moment, they just stood there. Two allies who had faced down a giant and, against all odds, had made him flinch. The sun felt warm and hopeful on her skin. No longer a harsh oppressor, but a benevolent witness. The victory, however, was a fragile thing, as thin as a sheet of ice on a winter morning. That night, the giant flinched back. Evelyn was in her small room, a single candle lit, trying to calm the joyful racing of her heart. A loud crash from outside sent a jolt of alarm through her. It came from the direction of her school. She grabbed a heavy shawl and hurried out into the darkness. What she saw stopped her breath. Her school, her small sanctuary of hope under the cottonwood, was being destroyed. 3 figures, their faces hidden by the darkness, were moving with a brutal, systematic violence. It was Sheriff Pike and 2 of his deputies. She recognized their shapes, the way they moved. They were not just vandals, they were assassins of hope. They smashed the children's slates against the trunk of the tree, the sound of the shattering stone like breaking bones. They ripped the pages from the few precious books she had, scattering them like dead leaves on the ground. They kicked over the benches she had so carefully arranged, splintering the wood. It was a violation, a furious, hateful desecration of everything she was trying to build. She stood frozen in the shadows, a wave of cold terror washing over her. This was the price of their victory. This was the answer of men who could not win with lies, and so turned to brute force. When they were finished, when the small clearing was a wreck of shattered dreams, Pike walked to the massive trunk of the cottonwood tree. He pulled a knife from his belt, the same knife he had used to cut a plug of tobacco that afternoon. In the faint moonlight, she saw the blade glint as he stabbed it deep into the bark, pinning a torn page from her book of Shakespeare to the tree. Then he turned and looked directly toward the shadows where she was hiding. He could not have seen her, but he knew she was there. He knew she would see his message. He said, his voice a low, chilling growl that carried on the night air, "This is your first and only warning. Schoolteacher, Red Mesa has no room for troublemakers. Pack your bags and get on the next stagecoach out. If you are still here by the end of the week, the next thing we burn will not be a building." The threat hung in the air, as sharp and cold as the blade of his knife. Then he and his men melted back into the darkness of the main street, leaving behind only destruction and the suffocating silence of their menace. Evelyn walked slowly into the clearing, her feet crunching on the fragments of slate. She looked at the wreckage, at the torn pages fluttering in the breeze, at the knife pinning a piece of her life's work to the tree. The hope and elation she had felt only hours before had curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear and fury in her stomach. She had won a battle in the sun, but in the darkness, she had learned the true nature of the war. It was not just about land or justice. It was a fight for her own survival. Sheriff Pike's threat was not a gust of wind that would blow over. It was a seed of violence planted in the dark, and Evelyn Hart had no intention of waiting for it to bear its bitter fruit. Fear was a cold, sharp thing, but she found that defiance was a fire that could hold it at bay. She did not pack her bags. She did not look for the next stagecoach. Instead, the morning after the destruction of her school, she went back to the cottonwood tree with a calm, deliberate patience. She began to pick up the torn pages of her books, to gather the splintered pieces of the benches, to pull Pike's knife from the heartwood of the tree. This was her ground, and she would not cede it. Nabahi found her there, a solitary figure in a landscape of her own small ruin. He had come expecting to find her gone, or at least packing to leave. He had seen the fear in her eyes the night before, but seeing her now, her jaw set, her hands methodically cleaning and sorting, he felt a profound and quiet admiration. The strength of this woman was not in the swing of an axe or the pull of a bowstring, but in a resilience as deep and stubborn as the roots of the ancient tree she stood under. He said, his voice soft, "They thought they could scare you away." Evelyn looked up, her hands dusty with the fragments of a slate. She said, "They made a mistake. They showed me how much this small place means to me. They showed me I cannot leave. We won in their courtroom, but they will not stop. What do we do now?" Nabahi, we have the truth, but they have the guns. Nabahi looked past her, toward the distant silhouette of the mines, a scar on the horizon. He said, then we must find a different kind of weapon, a truth so heavy it will crush them before they can pull the trigger. The destruction of the school and Pike's open threat had an unintended effect. It cracked the veneer of fear and apathy that held Red Mesa in its grip. The seed of courage that Miguel had planted at the trial began to sprout in unexpected places. Nabahi, moving with a quiet purpose, began to nurture it. He spoke first to the younger Navajo men, their anger still simmering from the fire and the arrest of Gray Owl. They were ready for a fight, and he did not discourage their fire. He channeled it. He said, our ancestors did not win battles with rage alone. They won with patience, with knowledge of the terrain, and by choosing the moment to strike. Our moment is coming. We must be ready. We must be disciplined. Then, with Miguel as his emissary, he met with a small group of miners in a hidden arroyo miles from the town. These were men who had seen their friend Miguel stand up and speak truth, and they had seen him keep his job only because Crowley feared making him a martyr. They were tired of the low pay, the dangerous conditions, and the arrogance of a boss who treated them as less than human. When Nabahi spoke of a plan to expose Crowley's corruption once and for all, they listened. His next visit was to a rancher named Jedediah Smith, a grizzled, pragmatic man whose land bordered the proposed railroad line. Smith was a man who kept to himself, who judged others not by their race, but by their word. Nabahi did not appeal to his sense of justice, but to his sense of survival. He laid out a map drawn in the dirt, showing how the railroad's deep cuts would divert the only creek that watered Smith's herds in the dry season. Smith chewed on a piece of straw for a long time. His eyes narrowed. He finally said, I do not want any trouble, but I will not stand by and watch my cattle die of thirst for Silas Crowley's profit. What do you need? The final piece of their strange alliance came from Evelyn. She sought out Sarah Johnson, a free black woman who had come west years before as a nurse with the Army. Sarah now served as the town's unofficial doctor, treating anyone who came to her door, regardless of their ability to pay. She was a woman of immense compassion and steely resolve, who had seen more than her share of injustice. Evelyn found her grinding herbs in her small, clean cabin. She told Sarah everything, about the fire, the trial, and Pike's threat. Sarah listened without interruption, her dark eyes thoughtful. When Evelyn had finished, Sarah said, Men like Crowley and Pike, they grow like poison weeds in places like this. If you do not pull them up by the roots, they choke out everything decent. I cannot offer you guns, child, but I can offer you my hands. If there is trouble, I will be there to patch up the wounded. And my cabin can be a safe place. No one would think to look for you here. And so it was that a small, secret army was born, a coalition of the dispossessed and the decent Navajo warriors, Mexican miners, a white schoolteacher, a black nurse, and a stubborn old rancher. They were united by a common enemy and a shared desire for a world where the law was not simply a weapon for the rich. Their opportunity came in the form of a coded message from Arthur Pence, delivered to Evelyn by a trusted freight worker. The clerk's terror was now outweighed by his conscience. The note was simple special train, Thursday, midnight, not on any schedule, carrying bonuses for the territorial marshal's office. All the evidence they needed of widespread bribery would be on that train. They met that night in Jedediah Smith's barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and nervous sweat. Using a lantern-lit map, Nabahi laid out the plan. He knew the rail line intimately. A few miles east of town, the unfinished track crossed a deep, narrow gorge on a newly built wooden trestle bridge. A train would have to slow to a crawl to cross it safely. That was where they would strike. He said, We are not robbers. We are not there to take money. We are there to find the proof, the ledgers, the payment records. They will be in a strongbox in the mail car, likely with a paymaster and 2 guards. Miguel, you and your men will know that car. You will create a diversion at the far end of the bridge. Jedediah, your men will be waiting with horses in the gorge below. Evelyn, you will come with me and Miguel. You can read their papers faster than any of us. You will identify what we need." Evelyn's heart pounded. This was no longer about testifying in a courtroom. This was dangerous, real. But she looked around the circle of determined faces and knew there was no other way. She nodded. "I will be there." Thursday night was a sliver of moon and a sky full of stars so bright they seemed to crackle in the cold, dry air. A biting wind swept across the plateau, making the trestle bridge moan like a living thing. They waited in the darkness, hidden among the rocks of the gorge, a small band of shadows against the immense landscape. The distant rumble came first, a vibration felt through the soles of their boots, then a faint pinpoint of light, the headlamp of the locomotive, growing steadily larger. The train was short, just an engine, a tender, and 2 cars. As it reached the approach to the bridge, it slowed, just as Nabahai had predicted, its steel wheels groaning in protest. At his signal, Miguel's men ignited a pile of brush on the tracks at the far end of the bridge. The sudden flare of light and smoke was the distraction they needed. As the engineer applied the brakes, Nabahai, Miguel, and Evelyn scrambled up the embankment and swung themselves aboard the mail car. Inside, a single paymaster and 2 armed guards looked up in stunned surprise. The fight was short and brutal. Nabahai moved with a fluid, disabling efficiency, using his good arm and the element of surprise to neutralize one guard while the miners swarmed the other 2. They found the strongbox, a heavy, iron-banded chest. It took 2 men to pry it open. Inside were stacks of money and several sealed envelopes addressed to prominent officials. It was a significant find, but Evelyn, her eyes scanning the contents, knew something was missing. The ledger, the detailed account book that would be the undeniable proof. She said, "It is not here. This is the payment, but not the record of it." Outside, shouts from the engine crew told them their time was running out. Miguel said, "We have to go. This is enough." But Evelyn's gaze was drawn to the locomotive. Through the open door, she could see the front of the engine, and on it, something she had noticed when the train first approached. It was a large, ornate brass cross, bolted to the engine's faceplate just below the headlamp. It was a strange, ostentatious display of piety for a simple work train. On a desperate hunch, she pushed past them. She said, "Wait." She ran along the narrow catwalk to the front of the engine. The engineer stared at her, his face white with fear. She ignored him, her fingers fumbling at the cross. It felt solid. But as her hands explored its surface, she found a small, almost invisible seam. She twisted it. With a faint click, the face of the cross swung open on a hinge. Inside, nestled in a hollowed-out compartment, was a leather-bound ledger. Her heart leaped. This was it, the absolute damning proof of Crowley's corruption, hidden in plain sight, masked by a symbol of faith. The sheer, blasphemous irony of it took her breath away. She grabbed the book just as a gunshot rang out. The rear guard had recovered and was firing wildly. She heard Nabahai shout her name. It was time to go. They leaped from the train onto the soft earth of the gorge. The ledger clutched tightly in Evelyn's hands. Jedediah's men were there with the horses, and they mounted and spurred their steeds into a gallop, melting into the network of canyons as the train's crew fired uselessly into the darkness. They rode hard for an hour, the wind a raw, scouring force against their faces, the sound of their horses' hooves echoing from the canyon walls. They were pursued, and they had to lose them. Nabahai led them on a difficult, dangerous path that ended at the banks of a river, swollen with recent rains from the mountains. It was the same river where he had bathed, where she had seen him in the sunset. But tonight it was a different creature, a churning, gray torrent in the starlight. He said, "We must cross. It is the only way." They plunged into the icy water, the horses fighting the current, the men shouting encouragement to each other. It was a chaotic, terrifying crossing, a shared struggle against the power of nature. Evelyn clung to her horse, the precious ledger held high, her body numb with cold. They emerged on the other side, dripping and exhausted, but they were safe. They had lost their pursuers. They found shelter in a small, protected cove, and Jedediah built a small, smokeless fire. The strange alliance of men huddled around it, sharing a flask of whiskey, their faces lit by the small flames. A bond of shared danger and triumph forged between them. Evelyn stood apart with Nabahi, looking back across the river. The adrenaline of the chase was fading, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and something else, a quiet, unshakable certainty. She said, her voice low, "I came to Red Mesa to teach children their letters. I thought I stayed because they needed me. After they destroyed my school, I thought I stayed out of anger, to fight back." She turned to look at him, his strong, calm face softened by the firelight. She said, "But that is not the only truth. I am staying because this is where I belong now. This fight is my fight, and I am staying because you are here." He did not reply immediately. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes holding a universe of unspoken emotion. He reached out and gently brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was warm against her cold skin. He said, his voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the river, "Then we will fight it together." It was not a declaration of love, not in the way the poets wrote about it. It was something more solid, more real. It was a statement of fact, a promise forged in fire and water, under a canopy of desert stars. They had the proof, they had each other, and they knew the real battle was just beginning. The discovery of the stolen ledger was a lit fuse thrown into the center of Silas Crowley's world, the carefully constructed edifice of his plans, built on lies and intimidation, was about to be blown apart. He could not afford to wait for the territorial marshal, for an official inquiry that would follow the trail of his own corrupted ink back to him. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, gripped him, but Crowley was a predator, and a cornered predator does not surrender, it attacks. By morning, Red Mesa was a tinderbox. Rumors, deliberately seeded by Crowley's men, spread like wildfire. The train was not carrying bribes, the stories went, but the town's payroll. It had been attacked not by a small band of dissenters, but by a Navajo war party. They were massing in the hills, emboldened by their success, preparing to burn the town to the ground. Fear, thick and choking, settled over the dusty streets. Crowley seized the moment. He stood on the porch of the land office, flanked by Sheriff Pike and a dozen hastily deputized men, their faces hard and their rifles held at the ready. He was no longer the suave businessman. He was a self-appointed savior, his voice ringing with false urgency and manufactured rage. He shouted to the frightened townspeople gathering below, "We are a town under siege. The savages have declared war on us all. They have attacked our lifeline, our connection to civilization. They seek to drive us out, to destroy everything we have built. The territorial government is too far away, too slow to act. We must defend ourselves. As of this moment, I am declaring a state of emergency. Sheriff Pike is authorized to use any means necessary to protect this town and its citizens from the native uprising." It was a coup, swift and brutal, cloaked in the language of self-defense. Pike and his men fanned out, their authority now absolute. They were no longer lawmen. They were an occupying army. Doors were kicked in, and any man suspected of sympathizing with the miners or the Navajo was dragged into the street. The town square became a cage. Word of the takeover reached Nabahi and his allies in Jedediah Smith's hidden canyon. The Navajo warriors, the miners, and the ranchers gathered, their faces grim. The hot-blooded youths wanted to ride in, to fight fire with fire. But Nabahi, his injured arm a dull, throbbing ache, counseled patience. He said, "This is the trap they have set for us. They want us to attack. They want to turn this into a battle so they can call it a massacre. They want our blood on the ground to wash away the ink in their ledger. We will not give them the war they want." He looked around the circle of determined, angry faces. He said, "We will go into the town, but we will not go to attack. We go to protect. Our fight is not with the people of Red Mesa. They are hostages, just as Evelyn is. We will position ourselves. We will prevent Pike's men from harming the innocent. We will show them that we are defenders, not destroyers. This will be a battle of discipline, not of rage." They rode not as a war party, but as a disciplined unit, entering Red Mesa from 3 different directions, melting into the alleys and onto the rooftops. The town square, where Pike had herded the terrified citizens, became a tense, silent battlefield. Pike's men held the center, their rifles pointed outward. From the shadows and the high ground, Nabahi's men watched, their own weapons ready but held in check. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Evelyn knew she was the primary target. The ledger, the physical proof of Crowley's crimes, was her knowledge, her weapon. She had hidden it safely at Sarah Johnson's cabin, a place of healing she hoped would remain a sanctuary. She was trying to make her way there, moving through the back alleys, when she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. She ran, her heart seizing with a terror that was colder and sharper than anything she had ever felt. It was Pike. He was hunting her, his bulky form moving with a surprising speed. He cornered her in a dead-end alley between the general store and a warehouse. He grabbed her, his hand like an iron clamp on her arm, his face twisted into a triumphant sneer. He said, his breath hot and sour, "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, schoolteacher. Now you are going to be my peace treaty." He dragged her out into the open, into the town square. The simmering standoff exploded into open conflict. A shot was fired, then another. The square erupted into a chaotic gunfight. Nabahi's men, true to his orders, fired with precision, not at the townspeople, but at Pike's deputies, forcing them to take cover, preventing them from turning their guns on the crowd. Nabahi himself, positioned on the roof of the blacksmith's shop, fired his rifle with a deadly accuracy. His shots aimed not to kill, but to pin down, to control the chaos. Pike held Evelyn in front of him, a human shield, and dragged her toward a large warehouse on the edge of the square. It was a dark, forbidding structure, smelling of old hay and rot, a place of shadows and confinement. He shoved her inside and barricaded the door, plunging them into a dim, dusty twilight. The shooting outside subsided into a tense, watchful silence. Pike's voice boomed from a window. He shouted, "Nabahi, I have your woman, the teacher. Throw down your weapons, all of you, or she dies right now." The world stopped. On the rooftop, Nabahi lowered his rifle. He could see Pike at the warehouse window, the glint of his pistol pressed against Evelyn's head. Every instinct, every bit of his warrior training screamed at him that this was a foolish, suicidal trap. But the sight of her, pale and terrified but with her chin held high, overrode everything else. The walls he had built inside himself, the discipline and the emotional distance, crumbled to dust. He called out, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent square, "Let her go. Pike, it is me you want. Let her walk out, and I will come to you, unarmed." A murmur went through the crowd. It was a hero's bargain, a trade of his life for hers. Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He said, "Just you. Come alone. Walk across the square with your hands high. Any tricks, and she is the one who pays." Nabahi did not hesitate. He climbed down from the roof and handed his rifle to a young warrior. He looked at him and said, "Hold your fire. No matter what happens, protect the people. This is my fight." He stepped out into the sunlit square, a lone, unarmed man walking into the heart of the enemy's power. He walked slowly, his hands raised, his injured arm a blaze of pain. Every window, every rooftop held a man with a rifle, but no one fired. The sheer, stark courage of his act held them all in a spell of disbelief. He reached the warehouse door, and it creaked open just enough for him to slip inside before being slammed shut behind him. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of shadows, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying straw. The only light came from dusty shafts slanting down from high, grimy windows. Pike stood in the center, his pistol still aimed at Evelyn. He was breathing heavily, his eyes glittering with a feral, triumphant light. He said, "You are a fool, Nabahi. You traded your life for a woman who is not even one of your own kind." Nabahi kept his eyes on Evelyn, trying to send her a message of calm, of hope. He said, "Let her go, Pike. She is no part of this now." Pike shoved Evelyn away from him. She stumbled and fell against a stack of burlap sacks. He laughed again. He said, "You are right. She is no part of this. This is between you and me." He lunged. He was bigger and stronger, and Nabahi was injured. The fight was a brutal, desperate affair. Pike fought like a brawler, with heavy, clubbing blows. Nabahi, even with one good arm, fought like a dancer, using his agility and knowledge of balance to evade and counter. But the enclosed space and his injury were a terrible disadvantage. Pike caught him with a heavy blow to the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He followed it with another to the head, and Nabahi went down, his vision exploding in a shower of black stars. Evelyn watched in horror. Pike stood over Nabahi, raising his pistol to deliver the final, killing shot. In that instant, something inside her broke. The fear, the passivity, the years of being a protected, sheltered woman. All of it was burned away in a blaze of pure, protective fury. She was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a partner in this fight. Her eyes darted around the dim warehouse, searching for a weapon. For anything. She saw a lantern, its glass clouded with grime, sitting on a crate. And next to it, a stack of sacks, one of them leaking a fine, white powder, lime, for whitewashing the walls. She did not think, she acted. She grabbed the leaking sack, and with a strength she did not know she possessed, she heaved it with all her might at Pike's head. The sack burst on impact, enveloping him in a thick, choking cloud of white dust. Pike roared in pain and confusion, the lime stinging his eyes, blinding him. He staggered back, clawing at his face, firing his pistol wildly into the dust-filled air. Evelyn did not stop. She snatched the lantern, and in a single and fluid motion, she struck the match she kept in her pocket and lit the wick. The flame sputtered to life. A small, brave star in the swirling chaos. She did not throw it to start a fire. She held it high, thrusting it forward into the white cloud, directly in front of Pike's face. The effect was explosive. The light of the flame, diffused and magnified by the millions of tiny particles of lime dust, became a blinding, incandescent flash, a miniature sun that obliterated all vision. Pike screamed, a raw, animal sound of agony, and stumbled backward, completely disoriented, his hands clamped over his ruined eyes. The momentary blindness was the opening Nabahi needed. He surged up from the floor, ignoring the pain in his arm and ribs, and tackled Pike, driving him hard into a stack of wooden crates. The gun flew from Pike's hand. The fight was over. As Nabahi tied the sheriff's hands with a piece of rope, Evelyn stood panting, the lantern held in her trembling hand, the air slowly clearing around them. They had done it. They had saved each other. A piece of paper had fallen from Pike's coat during the struggle. It lay on the dusty floor, a folded white square. Evelyn picked it up. It was a handwritten letter, the script bold and arrogant. She recognized it instantly. It was from Silas Crowley. She read it aloud, her voice shaking with a new kind of horror. It said, "Pike, the Army supply train is due to cross the trestle bridge tomorrow at dusk. Ensure the charges are set. When it goes, the whole territory will believe our story. They will have their war, and we will have our railroad." Nabahi looked at her, his face grim in the lantern light. The truth was finally, completely bare. This was never just about land. It was about provoking a war they intended to start with an act of mass murder and to lay the blame, and the graves at the feet of the Navajo. The fight in the warehouse was over, but the real battle, the race to save hundreds of innocent lives, had just begun. There was no time for deliberation, no time for anything but the raw, galvanizing shock of Crowley's letter. The warehouse, moments before a cage of personal terror, became the staging ground for a desperate, frantic race against the setting sun. Nabahi threw open the heavy doors, and the light that flooded in was the color of a dying fire. The sky already bleeding into the purples and oranges of dusk. The supply train was coming. The fuse was already lit. He did not have to explain. He held up the letter, and the members of their small, strange alliance, the miners, Jedediah's ranchers, the young Navajo warriors, understood instantly. The standoff in the square was forgotten. A smaller battle eclipsed by the looming specter of a massacre. Their ragged coalition surged into motion. A single organism driven by a single purpose: get to the trestle bridge. They rode like the wind itself, a frantic, desperate cavalry pounding across the high plateau. The horses, sensing the urgency, stretched their powerful legs, their hooves a thunderous drumbeat against the hard-packed earth. Evelyn rode alongside Nabahi, her body aching from the fight, her mind a razor-sharp blade of focus. She clutched Crowley's letter in her hand, the paper a flimsy, terrible testament to the evil they were racing to prevent. The trestle bridge loomed out of the twilight ahead of them, a delicate lacework of timber and steel spun across a deep, shadowed chasm. It was a thing of beauty and terrifying fragility, a lifeline that Crowley intended to turn into a mass grave. As they drew closer, they saw him a lone figure on a high, rocky outcrop a few hundred yards from the bridge, the setting sun glinting off the long barrel of a rifle. It was Crowley, positioned like a malevolent god, waiting to watch his terrible work unfold. Nabahi reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the terrain. He said, his voice tight and low, "He is there to make sure the job gets done. Miguel, take your men and Jedediah's. Circle around behind him. Keep him busy. Do not let him get a clear shot at the bridge. But do not get yourselves killed. He is just one man. The real enemy is the clock." As the others spurred their horses into the concealing shadows of the arroyos, Nabahi and Evelyn dismounted and ran toward the bridge. The wind was a physical force this high up, a wild, keening thing that tore at their clothes and tried to rip the breath from their lungs. It howled through the wooden beams of the trestle, making the entire structure vibrate with a low, mournful hum. Nabahi looked at the towering structure, then at Evelyn. He said, "The charges will be on the main support pylons. Underneath, I will go down. You stay here. Watch for the train." Evelyn's mind was racing. Her father's lessons in science and logic, things she had once considered academic exercises, now surging to the forefront. She grabbed his arm. She said, "No, wait, it will be a circuit, a wire and a detonator, probably powered by a battery. If you just cut the wire, you could complete the circuit. You have to find the power source and disconnect it first." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, and he saw not fear, but a fierce, focused intelligence. He had trusted her with his life once before. He would do it again. He nodded. "Tell me what to look for." She described a simple battery, a block of wood with 2 metal terminals, and the wires leading from it. She said, "Follow the wires from the charges back to the source. If you can break the connection there, the charges will be useless." He squeezed her hand, a brief, hard gesture of trust. And then he was gone, swinging himself over the edge of the bridge and disappearing into the dizzying web of beams and shadows below. Evelyn was alone on the bridge, the wind a-roaring in her ears. She forced herself to be calm, to be the eyes and the mind for the man hanging between the sky and the rocky floor of the gorge hundreds of feet below. She crept along the railway ties, peering down through the gaps, trying to follow his progress. Below, Nabahi moved with a terrifying grace, his hands and feet finding purchase on the narrow beams as if he were born to the heights. The wind tried to tear him from his hold, and the bridge groaned and swayed around him. His injured arm was a torment, a constant, screaming reminder of his vulnerability. He could hear his own heart, a frantic, wild thing, beating a rhythm that seemed to merge with the groaning of the wood and the howling of the wind. He found the first charge, a bundle of dynamite sticks lashed to a central support beam. Wires, like black metal snakes, snaked away from it into the darkness. Far below, he could hear the first crack of a rifle. Then another. Miguel and the others had engaged Crowley. The battle for the bridge had begun. On the tracks above, Evelyn saw a splinter of wood fly from a tie just inches from her foot. Crowley was shooting at her. She threw herself flat, her cheek pressed against the cold steel of the rail. She could hear the whine of the bullets as they ricocheted off the track. She had to guide Nabahi, but she was pinned down. She shouted into the wind, her voice thin and ragged. "Nabahi, can you see the wires?" His voice came back, faint and distorted by the gale. "I see them. They lead to the far pylon." She crawled along the tracks, keeping her head low, splinters tearing at her hands. She reached the other side and peered down again. From this angle, she could see a small wooden box tucked into a joint between two massive beams. The battery. She screamed. "The box! By your right hand. That is the source. Disconnect the wires from the box." As Nabahi began to work his way toward it, a bullet slammed into the beam just above his head, showering him with wooden shards. Crowley had seen him. He was a clear target now. Then Miguel appeared, a figure of pure, selfless courage. He had climbed partway up the rock face of the gorge, placing himself between Crowley and the bridge, drawing the sniper's fire. He held a pistol, firing back at the outcrop, not to hit Crowley, but to distract him. Crowley's rifle cracked, and Miguel cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain. He slumped against the rock, his leg shattered, but even as he fell, he reached out and grabbed one of the main detonation wires that had been strung along the canyon wall, pulling it taut, away from the bridge, trying to break it with his bare hands. The distraction, bought with his own blood, gave Nabahi the seconds he needed. He reached the box. The two wires were attached to two brass terminals. He drew his knife. Evelyn, seeing him hesitate, screamed. "The red one first. If there is a red one, cut it first." It was a guess, a half-remembered line from a textbook about positive and negative charges. She prayed she was right. There was no red wire. Both were black, coated in tar. He had to choose. At that moment, a new sound cut through the wind and the gunfire, a low, rhythmic chugging that grew steadily louder. The train, its headlamp was a single, baleful eye. Rounding a curve in the distance, they were out of time. Nabahi looked from one wire to the other. His warrior's instinct, his lifetime of reading the subtle signs of the world took over. One wire was stretched just a fraction tighter than the other. It felt like the string of a bow that was ready to fire. He did not know why, but he knew it was the one. He slashed his knife through it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The train bore down on them, its whistle screaming a frantic warning. The wind howled. Crowley's rifle cracked again. And then the second wire, now bearing all the tension, snapped at the terminal. The connection was broken. Nabahi hung from the beam, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. As the army supply train thundered onto the bridge, the cars rattling and swaying just feet above his head, and passed safely to the other side. The bridge held. The plan had failed. The war had been averted. The train screeched to a halt on the far side of the gorge. Soldiers pouring out, alerted by the gunfire. Crowley, seeing his plan in ruins, fired one last frustrated shot and then scrambled down from his outcrop, running for a horse he had hidden nearby. But his escape was cut off. The townspeople, led by Jedediah Smith, had arrived. They had seen the heroism, had heard the story from the men who had returned from the square. They formed a silent, grim-faced wall, blocking his path. Crowley looked at their faces he had lied to and manipulated, and saw no mercy. His reign was over. A young army captain, his face taut with confusion and anger, strode onto the bridge. He saw the gathered townspeople. the wounded Miguel being tended to by Sarah Johnson, and the armed Navajo and ranchers. He saw Silas Crowley, a man he knew as a pillar of the territory, being held at gunpoint. The captain demanded, "What in the name of God is going on here?" "Mister," Crowley reported a full-scale native uprising. "He said you were trying to destroy this bridge." Crowley, finding his voice, sputtered, "It is true. These savages attacked us. I was trying to defend the train." But his lies had run out of power. Evelyn Hart walked forward out of the twilight, her face smudged with dirt, her dress torn, her eyes blazing with an unshakable conviction. She did not have the ledger with her. She had something better, something that told the entire story in a single, damning object. She held up the hollow brass cross. She said to the captain, "Mister, Crowley is a man who hides his darkest sins behind a symbol of faith. We have the proof of his crimes. Treason, bribery, and a plan to start a war by murdering your men. It is all in his own handwriting." She offered the cross to the stunned officer, its hollow heart a final, irrefutable witness to the depths of Silas Crowley's evil. The bridge stood, a testament not to the men who built it, but to the unlikely alliance who had saved it, connecting their two worlds not with steel and wood, but with shared courage and a desperate, triumphant hope. The aftermath on the bridge was a tableau of surreal stillness after the storm of violence. The wind still howled through the gorge, but the gunfire was replaced by the low, confused murmur of the soldiers and the quiet, grim satisfaction of the townspeople who had finally seen the truth. Captain Hayes, the young officer whose world had been turned upside down in the space of 10 minutes, took the hollow cross from Evelyn's hand, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and dawning horror. Silas Crowley, his face a mask of pasty, defeated rage, did not resist as two soldiers took him into custody. Sheriff Pike, still moaning and clawing at his temporarily blinded eyes, was hauled to his feet, a pathetic, whimpering wreck of a man who had built his power on the fear he now felt so acutely. The ledger, retrieved from Sarah Johnson's cabin, was presented to the captain, its neat columns of figures and names a silent, irrefutable confession of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the dusty streets of Red Mesa. In the days that followed, a fragile, uncertain peace settled over the territory. The Army established a temporary command post, and Captain Hayes, a man who proved to be as methodical as he was honorable, began a thorough investigation. The railroad project was officially and indefinitely suspended. Soldiers, not deputies, now walked the streets of Red Mesa, their presence a constant reminder that the old order had been shattered. Crowley and Pike were transported under heavy guard to the territorial prison to await a federal trial, their departure marked not by anger or celebration, but by a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The poison had been lanced. Now, the slow, painful work of healing had to begin. The idea came not from one person, but from a shared, unspoken need. It was Gray Owl, his dignity restored, and Jedediah Smith, the crusty, pragmatic rancher, who gave it a voice. They would hold a feast, a gathering not of victory, but of thanks. Thanks for the lives that had been saved, for the truth that had been revealed, and for the rain that had finally washed the air clean of the scent of smoke and gunpowder. They met in a wide, grassy meadow, a neutral ground between the town and the lands of the Navajo. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows, the people came. They came in small, hesitant groups, at first the miners, led by Miguel, whose leg was healing in a splint fashioned by Sarah Johnson, the ranchers, their face weathered and watchful, the townspeople, their expressions a mixture of shame for their complicity and gratitude for their deliverance, and the Navajo, who came not as a defeated people seeking charity, but as hosts on their own land. Fires were lit, and the smell of roasting venison and baking cornbread mingled in the cool evening air. For a time, people kept to their own groups, the invisible walls of prejudice and fear still standing, though weakened. But then Sarah Johnson, with a quiet authority that transcended race, began to move between the fires, carrying a pot of her strong, bitter coffee, offering it to everyone. Her presence a gentle insistence that they were all one community now, bound by the shared trauma they had endured. As the stars emerged, a vast, glittering canopy in the clear desert sky, Gray Owl and the other elders began to sing. It was not a war chant. It was a blessing way song, a low, rhythmic chant that spoke of harmony, of walking in beauty, of restoring the world to balance. The melody was ancient and hypnotic, and it seemed to flow into the hearts of everyone listening, soothing the raw, wounded places. It was a song of healing, and it washed over the assembled crowd, a balm for the soul of the community. When the last notes of the chant had faded into the vast silence, Evelyn and her students came forward. In the days since the battle, she had re-established her school under the cottonwood tree, her small group of pupils a testament to the stubborn resilience of hope. In their hands, they carried small, simple lanterns, fashioned from hollowed-out gourds, each with a small candle burning brightly inside. One by one, they lit them, the small, flickering flames, a constellation of man-made stars in the darkness. The children, Navajo, Mexican, and white, moved among the crowd, their faces glowing with a solemn pride, and placed the lanterns on the surface of the small creek that meandered through the meadow. The gourds floated away on the gentle current, a silent, beautiful procession of light, a promise of a new and shared path forward. Later that evening, when the feast was winding down and the people were talking in low, easy voices, Nabahi came to where Evelyn was standing, watching the last of the lanterns disappear around a bend in the creek. He did not speak, but simply stood beside her, his presence a warm, solid comfort in the cool night air. After a long, comfortable silence, he said, "Let us walk." He led her away from the fires, their footsteps soft on the damp earth. Following the path of the creek until it joined the larger river, they came to a place where the bank was wide and sandy, a familiar cove sheltered by cottonwoods. It was the same spot where he had bathed, where she had first seen the truth of him, a place that was sacred in the geography of their shared story. The moon was high now, casting a silver light on the surface of the water, which flowed with a calm, steady power. The charged tension of their last visit here was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet peace. They were no longer a warrior and a teacher, hiding from the world. They were a man and a woman who had walked through the fire together and had come out the other side, changed but whole. Evelyn looked at his profile in the moonlight, at the strong, calm lines of his face. His arm, though still bandaged, was healing. The weight of his people's survival was no longer on his shoulders alone. She said, her voice soft, "I never thought I would see a night like this. I thought the fire would consume everything." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes holding the reflection of the moon. He said, "Fire can cleanse as well as destroy. It burned away the lies. Now, we must see what can grow from the ashes." They stood for a moment, the only sound the murmur of the river and the whisper of the wind in the cottonwood leaves. She had been the one protected, the one he had bargained his life for in the warehouse. But she had also been the one who had saved him, her quick thinking and unexpected ferocity turning the tide of their desperate fight. They were partners, equals, each the other's strength. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and calloused, a warrior's hand, but his touch was gentle. He said, his voice a low, intimate murmur, "I remember the first time we were here. The sun was setting. You were afraid, but you did not look away. That day, you looked right at me." He turned to face her fully, his other hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. He said, "But today, Evelyn Hart, I want to look right at the future with you." The words were a promise, a foundation stone laid for a life she had never dared to imagine. It was a proposal more profound than any she had read in her books, an offering of a shared path, a shared struggle, a shared peace. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He leaned in and kissed her, a light, tender kiss that held no desperate passion, but a universe of quiet commitment. It was a kiss of homecoming, of two souls finding their place in the world, together. He kept her hand in his, their fingers intertwined, a simple, solid connection that felt more powerful and enduring than the ancient rocks around them. A week later, a military rider brought a dispatch from the territorial capital. Captain Hayes summoned Evelyn and Nabahi to his office. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been a week ago. He held an official letter in his hand. He said, "The investigation is proceeding. Crowley and Pike will face justice. Your testimonies and the ledger have seen to that." He paused, and a shadow of weariness crossed his face. He said, "But this is a letter from Washington, from the Department of the Interior. It seems Mr. Crowley had very powerful friends who are now working very hard to protect their own investments." He pushed the letter across the desk. Evelyn read it, Nabahi looking over her shoulder. The words were couched in the careful, bloodless language of bureaucracy. But their meaning was clear. The Red Mesa Railroad project was under review. But it was not canceled. The powerful interests behind it were arguing that the route was essential, that Crowley was just one bad apple. They were proposing to continue the project under new, federally approved management. Evelyn looked up from the letter, a cold knot forming in her stomach. They had won the battle, had cut off the head of the snake here in Red Mesa. But the snake was larger than they had ever imagined, its body stretching all the way to the marble halls of a distant capital, its coils wrapped around money and power she could not comprehend. She looked at Nabahi. His face was calm, his expression unreadable, but she saw in his eyes a familiar, deep resolve. The peace they had found was real, but it was a clearing in a vast, dark forest. The fight was not over. Justice was not a single victory, but a long, hard road they would have to walk, day by day, and they would walk it together. The letter from Washington was not a treaty of peace, but a notice of a ceasefire. It hung in the air between them, a cold reminder that the world was larger and more rapacious than Red Mesa. But the threat was distant, a shadow on a far horizon. The work of rebuilding, of planting seeds in the scorched earth of their community, was here and now, a tangible and demanding reality. The first act of reconstruction was not with bricks and mortar, but with slate and chalk, under the great cottonwood tree, its bark scarred by Pike's knife, but its leaves green and rustling with life. The Red Mesa School was reborn. It was no longer a fringe enterprise, a charitable act of defiance. It was the heart of the new community they were trying to build. The children came, a small, hopeful assembly of the future, the Navajo girls, their shyness replaced by a quiet confidence, Miguel's son, Mateo, his bright eyes hungry for knowledge, and now, even the children of the townspeople, including the daughter of Martha Cushing, who had once been so scornful, came to sit on the newly built benches. The invisible walls that had divided them had begun to crumble. Evelyn Hart taught them reading, history, and arithmetic, her voice a calm, steady presence against the whisper of the wind. She taught them that words could be bridges, not weapons, that numbers could build a better world, and that the past, with all its pain and its heroism, was a lesson they all shared. But this new school had two teachers. While Evelyn worked with slates, Nabahi worked with the earth. He did not teach from a book. He took the children to the edge of the plains and taught them to read a different kind of language, the story told by a broken twig, the meaning of a hawk's circling shadow, the precise shape of a coyote's track in the dust. He taught them which plants could heal and which could harm, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to listen to the land and understand its secrets. He was teaching them not just to live in the world, but to be a part of it. It was a complete education, a weaving together of two kinds of knowledge, a curriculum of survival and of hope. Their second project was a testament to this new partnership. On a fertile patch of land beside the river, the same river that had witnessed their journey from suspicion to love. They planted a garden. It was an act of faith in a land that was often cruel and unforgiving. Evelyn brought her knowledge from books, an understanding of crop rotation and soil composition. Nabahi brought the wisdom of generations. He showed her the old ways, how his ancestors had coaxed life from the dry soil. He engineered a small, brilliant acequia, a narrow, stone-lined channel that diverted a trickle of water from the river and carried it in a gentle, life-giving stream through the rows of newly planted corn, beans, and squash. It was a simple, elegant system, a collaboration with the water, not a conquest of it. They worked side by side, their hands in the same earth, planting the seeds that would feed the community. It was hard, physical work under the hot sun, but it was joyful work, a tangible act of creation that healed the wounds of the past with every seed they planted. The political healing took longer, but it too began to take root. A new community council was formed, a body as unlikely as the alliance that had saved the bridge. Jedediah Smith, his stubborn independence tempered by a new sense of civic duty, was its chairman. Gray Owl sat beside him, his presence a quiet reminder of the deep history of the land. Miguel represented the miners, his voice, once hesitant, now strong and clear. Even Martha Cushing, humbled by the near destruction of her town, took a place on the council, her sharp tongue now used to argue for practicality and order. Their first official act was a direct response to the weaponized paper of Silas Crowley. They drafted a new town ordinance, a simple, powerful law that would change the balance of power forever. From that day forward, any contract concerning the sale or lease of land within the territory of Red Mesa had to be written in both English and Navajo. Furthermore, before any signature could be considered valid, the contract had to be read aloud, in both languages, before a public meeting of the full community council. Never again, they vowed, would the people of this land be tricked by words they could not read, by promises that were as empty as the wind. It was a fortress built not of stone, but of shared understanding. Their own union was just as quiet and just as strong. There was no grand ceremony, no white dress or formal pronouncements in a church. Their wedding was a simple gathering of friends by the river bank as the sun began to set. Gray Owl performed a blessing, his voice a low, melodic chant, asking for harmony and a long life together. Jedediah Smith, in his capacity as council chairman, spoke a few plain, heartfelt words, officially recognizing their marriage in the eyes of the law. Evelyn wore a simple blue dress, and in her hair, Sarah Johnson had woven the small, hardy purple flowers that grew wild in the canyons. Nabahi wore clean buckskins, a single hawk feather tied in his dark hair. They did not exchange rings of gold, but of woven sweetgrass, a symbol of the land and of the flexible, unbreakable bond between them. They spoke no elaborate vows. They simply stood before their community, their hands clasped, and in their eyes, everyone could see the depth of their commitment, a promise not just to each other, but to the future they were all building together. That night, after the last of their friends had departed, they sat together on the familiar sandy bank of the river. A fire, small and intimate, crackled nearby. The sunset was a masterpiece of crimson and gold, and the water flowed past them, a constant, soothing murmur. The love they felt was no longer the sharp, breathless discovery of their first moments here. It had deepened, matured, its roots intertwined with the shared struggle, the pain, and the triumph. It was not an escape from the world, but an embrace of it, a commitment to protect, to nurture, to build. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon. The air grew cool, and the first stars appeared, bright and clear in the darkening sky. A telegraph had arrived that afternoon for Captain Hayes, who had shown it to them with a grim sense of duty. A new railroad conglomerate, an entity even larger and more powerful than Crowley's, had expressed a formal interest in the Red Mesa survey. The shadow on the horizon had a name now. The world, with its insatiable appetite, would be back. But tonight, that distant threat felt small and insignificant. Tonight, there was only the peace of the river, the warmth of the fire, and the solid, reassuring presence of each other. They had faced down the darkness and had found their own light. They had learned that a community was not a collection of buildings, but a web of trust. They had learned that a future was not something to be waited for, but something to be built, with your own two hands, in the soil you call home. The desert was still harsh, but the seeds now understood the way of the water. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.